"Don't watch the camera tonight," she texted. But I did. I wish I could erase the footage of what happened in that kitchen at 11:27 p.m. I had spent my life believing that silence was the only way to survive him. But after that recording, I understood there was no other choice left for me but revenge. My name is Mallory. I am 34 years old, and my life is a fortress built of quiet, deliberate choices. I live on the 7th floor of a glass and steel building in downtown Denver that hums with the anonymous energy of 1,000 other lives, none of which ever intersect with mine beyond a polite nod in the elevator. My apartment is a study in muted grays and clean lines, a space where every object has a purpose and a place. There is no clutter. Clutter, I have found, is the physical manifestation of an untended mind. My mind is meticulously tended by day. I am an in-house paralegal for Uniplex Health, a private medical corporation whose sprawling campus is a city unto itself. My work is a labyrinth of contracts, compliance statutes, and non-disclosure agreements. I am good at it. I find comfort in the rigid architecture of the law, in the way language can be sharpened and deployed to build walls or dismantle arguments. My colleagues know me as efficient, private, and perhaps a little cold. They don't ask about my weekends, and I don't offer any information. There is little to tell. My weekends are spent much like my weekdays in controlled, predictable silence, reading, working, running along the Cherry Creek Trail until my lungs burn and the noise in my head finally subsides. This carefully curated solitude is my greatest achievement. It is a sanctuary I began building the day I turned 18 and packed 2 suitcases into the back of a beat-up Honda Civic. Leaving behind the small, suffocating house in the suburbs where I grew up, the house that belonged to my mother and to Bruce. Bruce? The name still feels foreign on my tongue. Even after 2 decades, he is not my father. My father was a ghost, a black and white photograph on my mother's dresser who died in a car crash when I was 2. Bruce was the man who replaced him when I was 12, a contractor with a booming voice, hands the size of dinner plates, and a presence that seemed to suck all the oxygen out of a room. He wasn't overtly cruel at first. He was just there, a heavy, unmovable object in the center of my world. My mother, a woman who had spent 10 years navigating the world with the timid grace of a widow, seemed to fold herself into a smaller shape around him. Her laughter became quieter, her opinions softer, her movements more hesitant. Bruce's brand of control was insidious. It was in the way he'd comment on my clothes, my grades, the friends I chose. "Is that what you're wearing?" he'd ask, his eyes scanning me with a look of faint disgust that made my skin crawl. "You're smart, Mallory. Don't start acting stupid like those other girls." His approval was a currency I was never given, only told I was failing to earn. "He just wants the best for you, honey," my mother would whisper later, wringing her hands. In the quiet of the kitchen, he has high standards. I learned to live within his standards. I became quiet. I became invisible. I learned that the path of least resistance was a straight, silent line. But silence isn't always enough. I was 16. I had been late coming home from a movie with friends, not by much, maybe 20 minutes. But the front door was locked, the porch light off. I knocked, my stomach tightening into a cold knot. Bruce opened the door. He didn't yell. Yelling would have been a relief. Instead, he just stared at me, his face a mask of cold fury. My mother hovered behind him, a pale shadow in the dim hallway. "Where have you been?" His voice was low, a gravelly rumble. "The movie ran late." "I'm sorry." "You're sorry." He repeated the words, not as a question, but as an indictment. He stepped aside to let me in, and as I brushed past him, his hand shot out and grabbed my arm. His grip was like iron. He spun me around, and before I could register what was happening, the back of his hand connected with my cheek. The shock was absolute. It wasn't the pain, though my face stung with a white-hot fire, it was the violation. The sudden, brutal crossing of a line I didn't even know existed. The sound of the slap echoed in the small entryway, a dead flat punctuation mark. In the ringing silence that followed, I looked past him, my eyes pleading with my mother. She stood frozen, one hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that was not for me, but of him. She didn't move. She didn't speak. In her silence, I heard my sentence, "You are on your own." That was the moment I stopped fighting. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply looked down at the floor, tasting blood from where my teeth had cut the inside of my cheek. I learned the most important lesson of my life in that hallway: do not react. Do not confront. Do not make a sound. Your survival depends on your ability to absorb the impact and disappear. Bruce let go of my arm, a grunt of satisfaction escaping his lips. He had won. He had broken something in me, and he knew it. 2 years later, I left for college and never truly came back. My contact with them dwindled to obligatory holiday phone calls and birthday cards. I never spoke of that night. We all pretended it hadn't happened, burying it under years of stilted conversations about the weather and my career. Yet, I couldn't sever the cord completely. My mother was still my mother, so I sent money. Every month, a direct deposit appeared in her bank account. It was my penance, my apology for leaving her there. It was my way of taking care of her from a safe distance, a transaction that kept our relationship alive without requiring any real intimacy. It was the price of my freedom. Last year, after a string of burglaries in her neighborhood, I used that as an excuse to install a security system in her house. "It's for your safety, Mom," I insisted over the phone, my voice infused with the calm, professional tone I used at work. I bought the best system I could find: high-definition cameras, motion sensors, and a cloud-based storage service that kept a rolling 30-day record of all footage. I set it up myself on a weekend visit, placing the small, discreet cameras in the living room, the hallway, and the kitchen. My mother, who still struggled with her television remote, was blissfully unaware of the system's full capabilities. She knew how to arm and disarm it. She had no idea that I could log in from my laptop in Denver, 700 miles away, and watch her life in real time. I told myself it was for her protection, for peace of mind. But if I were honest, a darker, more watchful part of me wanted to keep an eye on him. I rarely checked the feed. Doing so felt like a violation, a confirmation of the mistrust that had poisoned my childhood. For months, the system was just an icon on my desktop. A silent guardian I chose to ignore. Until tonight, a cold, bleak night in the middle of February. A notification popped up on my phone. Motion detected in kitchen. It was late. After 11, I almost dismissed it. It was probably just the cat, but something made me pause. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, washed over me. I opened my laptop, my fingers trembling slightly as I typed in the password. The feed loaded, showing the empty, familiar kitchen, bathed in the cold, sterile glow of the under-cabinet lighting. For a moment, nothing happened. I was about to close the window, annoyed at my own paranoia. And then they walked in, and I saw it. I saw the thing I can no longer pretend I never saw. The fortress I had built around my life, stone by silent stone, began to crumble. It started with a ghost, a phantom message that appeared on my phone screen for no more than 5 seconds before vanishing completely. I had been sitting on my sofa, the glow of my laptop casting long shadows across the room, the half-written legal brief in front of me entirely forgotten. My phone lying face down on the cushion beside me vibrated once. I picked it up. A text from my mother. The preview on the lock screen read, "Don't watch the camera tonight." A jolt, electric and cold, shot through me. My thumb was still hovering over the notification when it slid away, disappearing as if it had never been there. I unlocked the phone. The message thread was empty, deleted, a void where a warning had been. My breath caught in my chest. It wasn't a request. It was a plea. A desperate, terrified plea from a prisoner smuggled out of a cell and then snatched back. Why? What was happening tonight that I wasn't supposed to see? The question was a hook, and it pulled me from the sofa to my desk. My earlier dread now sharpened into a blade of pure, focused alarm. I had already logged into the security system. The live feed from the kitchen was a small, silent window on my screen. I stared into it, my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. For a long minute, the kitchen remained empty, a silent stage. The fluorescent light above the sink cast a sterile glare on the linoleum floor. The clock on the microwave read 11:19 p.m. And then they entered from the hallway, and the air in my own apartment grew thick and hard to breathe. Bruce came first. He moved with a heavy, deliberate tread that I remembered from childhood, a walk that announced his ownership of any space he occupied. His shoulders were bunched up around his ears, his face flushed a dark, mottled red. He wasn't speaking, but a low, guttural sound rumbled in his chest. The growl of an animal circling its prey. My mother followed a few steps behind him, a satellite caught in a decaying orbit. She was holding a water glass in one hand, her movements small and placating. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. I knew that posture. It was the shape of surrender. You think I'm stupid? Bruce's voice, filtered through the tiny microphone of the camera, was distorted and sharp, like grinding metal. He stopped in the center of the room and turned to face her. You think I don't know what you're doing? I don't know what you mean, Bruce, my mother said, her voice barely a whisper. I just paid the electric bill like you asked. The electric bill, he repeated, his voice dripping with a contempt so potent I could almost taste it. He took a step toward her, and she instinctively took one back, her free hand fluttering near her throat. This is about respect, something you know nothing about. I leaned closer to my screen, my knuckles white where I gripped the edge of my desk. The paralegal in my brain was screaming, a frantic internal monologue of objections and statutes, but the terrified 16-year-old girl was the one in control, frozen, watching the monster that haunted her nightmares. He stalked to the counter, his back to the camera, and poured a dark liquid from a bottle into a glass. Whiskey, the fuel. You went behind my back, he hissed. You called your sister. What did you tell her? That I'm not providing for you, that you're unhappy. No, Bruce. I would never, my mother stammered, her voice trembling. She just called to ask about her grandson's birthday. That's all. Liar. The word was a gunshot in the quiet kitchen. He slammed his whiskey glass down on the counter. It didn't break, but the sound was like a crack of lightning. You are a pathetic, ungrateful liar. He advanced on her then, and there was nowhere for her to go. She backed away until her spine was flat against the pantry door. He stood over her, his large frame blocking her from the camera's view, but I could see the side of his face, the muscles in his jaw working furiously. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could see his spittle flying, see the way my mother's head jerked with each silent verbal assault. And then he stepped back, as if to admire his work. My mother was weeping now, silent tears tracking paths down her pale cheeks. She still held the water glass, her hand shaking so badly that water sloshed over the rim and onto the floor. That small spill seemed to sever the last thread of his control. A roar of pure, animalistic fury erupted from his throat. He lunged forward, snatched the glass from her hand, and hurled it against the opposite wall. It exploded in a shower of glittering shards and water droplets. The sound was so loud, so sudden, that I flinched back from my own screen. My mother cried out, a small, choked gasp. It was the only sound of protest she made. But he wasn't finished. He grabbed her by the shoulders and shoved her hard. Her head hit the pantry door with a sickening thud that the microphone picked up with perfect, horrifying clarity. She slid down the door, landing in a heap on the floor among the shards of broken glass. I couldn't breathe. My vision tunneled until the only thing that existed was that small, bright rectangle on my screen. I watched, a helpless, disembodied ghost, as he stood over her, breathing heavily. He looked around the kitchen, his eyes wild and searching, and they landed on the broom leaning against the refrigerator. He picked it up. He held it like a bat. My mother was trying to push herself up, her hands slipping on the wet floor. She was on her hands and knees when he swung. He didn't use the bristle end. He used the handle, a solid piece of wood. He brought it down across her back. The sound was dull, a heavy, wet thwack of wood meeting flesh and bone. My mother's body convulsed, and she collapsed onto her side, curling into a tight ball, her arms wrapped around her head. He hit her again and again. I counted the blows, 1, 2, 3. He stood over her, the broom handle held loosely in his hand, his chest heaving. The kitchen was silent again, save for his ragged breathing and the sound of my mother's muffled sobs. And then she spoke. Her voice, broken and raw, was clear enough for the camera to capture. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the floor. "I'm so sorry, Bruce. I'm so sorry." The scene broke me. It was not the violence, as horrific as it was. It was her apology. It was the sound of a soul so completely broken, that it thanked its own executioner. It was the final, irrefutable proof that the woman who had raised me was gone, replaced by this hollowed-out shell, who believed she deserved the pain. On the screen, Bruce grunted, dropped the broom with a clatter, and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her there on the floor. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at my mother's cold form on the kitchen floor, 700 miles away. The trembling started in my hands and spread through my entire body until my teeth were chattering. A wave of nausea rose in my throat, hot and acidic. But beneath the shock, beneath the horror and the grief, something else was happening. A tectonic shift. The terrified 16-year-old who had learned to be silent was dying. And in her place, something cold and hard and sharp was being forged. The paralegal, the analyst, the strategist. My trembling hands moved from my lap to the mouse. My movements were slow at first, then more certain. I navigated the software, my mind a sudden, startling oasis of calm. I found the recording log. I isolated the clip timestamped from 11:19 p.m. to 11:27 p.m. 8 minutes of hell. I clicked download. The progress bar filled with an agonizing slowness. While it downloaded, I got up, my legs unsteady, and retrieved the external hard drive I kept in my desk drawer. It was a small black rectangle, cold to the touch. The file saved to my desktop. I didn't watch it again. I didn't need to. It was seared onto the inside of my eyelids. I plugged in the hard drive. The icon appeared on my screen. I dragged the video file, its name a generic string of numbers and letters, and dropped it into the drive. I made a second copy and uploaded it to a secure, encrypted cloud server I used for work, a failsafe. When it was done, I ejected the drive and held it in the palm of my hand. It felt impossibly heavy. A small, dense star of pure darkness. The silence of my apartment pressed in on me. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was no longer the silence of peace. It was the silence of a held breath. The silence before the storm. The silence of a plan beginning to form. I sat in the dark for over an hour, the external hard drive a cold, dead weight in my hand. The city of Denver hummed and glittered outside my 7th-floor window, a universe away from the silent, brutal stage of my mother's kitchen. The initial tidal wave of shock had receded, leaving behind the wreckage of my carefully constructed life. In its place, ghosts began to stir, walking out of the locked rooms of my memory where I had imprisoned them for 16 years. I saw myself at 14, proudly showing Bruce a history paper I'd gotten an A on. He'd glanced at it, his lip curling into a sneer. "Anyone can get an A in history," he'd said, turning back to his newspaper. "It's just memorizing dates. Come back when you've accomplished something that requires actual intelligence." I had folded the paper into a small, tight square, walked to my room, and torn it into confetti. My mother found me crying later. "Oh, honey," she'd soothed, stroking my hair. "You know how he is. He's just stressed from work. He doesn't mean it." I saw myself at 15, begging to be allowed to go to a sleepover at a friend's house. Bruce had forbidden it. No reason given, just a flat, unappealable no. When I dared to ask why, he'd loomed over me, his voice a low threat, "Because I said so. This is my house and my rules. You don't need a reason." I had looked to my mother for support, for any sign of an alliance. She just gave a weak, apologetic shrug and busied herself with the dishes, her back turned to me. Later that night, she slipped into my room. "It's easier if you don't argue." More leery, she'd whispered. "Don't make a big deal out of it. It's not worth the fight. He's just stressed. Don't make a big deal." The phrases echoed in my mind, a toxic refrain that had scored the soundtrack of my adolescence. They were the lullabies of my mother's denial, the magic words she used to shrink every act of cruelty, every casual degradation into something manageable, something that could be tided away like dust. She wasn't protecting me. She was protecting the fragile piece of her own existence, a piece purchased at the cost of my spirit. I had learned the lesson she taught me. My pain was a nuisance, my feelings an overreaction. The best thing to do was to make myself smaller, quieter, to stop making a big deal. And for 16 years, I had believed I'd escaped that. I had built a life that was the very antithesis of that house. My success was my shield. My career in the rigid, logical world of law was my fortress. My quiet, solitary apartment was my sanctuary. I had mistaken distance for safety, silence for peace. I had told myself a story where I was the survivor who got away, who healed herself through discipline and sheer force of will. I had looked at my life, the good job, the financial independence, the emotional control, and I had thought I'd won. The video shattered that illusion into a million pieces. As I sat there, the weight of the hard drive grounding me in the horrifying present, I understood. I hadn't escaped anything. I had only changed my address. The violence in that house had never ended. The cancer was never cured. The patient had just been switched. When I was no longer there to absorb the blows, verbal or physical, the rage simply found a new target, a softer target, one who had been conditioned for decades to accept it, one who would apologize for being hit. A new emotion, hot and pure, began to burn through the cold fog of my shock. It was rage. A rage so profound it felt like it could crack my ribs. It was a rage for the 16-year-old girl who was taught that her pain didn't matter. It was a rage for my mother, for the woman she could have been before he hollowed her out. And it was a white-hot, focused rage for him, for Bruce, for the man who had built his kingdom on the quiet suffering of others. My silence was over. The vow I had made to myself in that hallway, the survival tactic of non-reaction, was a covenant made by a child. I was not a child anymore. I was a 34-year-old woman with a deep understanding of the law, and a piece of evidence that could send him to jail for years. My first instinct was primal. Call the police. Send them the video. Let the world see the monster for who he was. My hand reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over the keypad, ready to dial 911. But I stopped. My legal mind, my greatest weapon, kicked in, overriding the emotional impulse. It played out the scenario with cold, brutal clarity. I call the police. They go to the house. They question Bruce. He denies everything. They question my mother. And what does she do? The image was so clear. It was like watching another video clip. I could see her wringing her hands, her eyes wide with fear, not of him, but of the disruption, of the police cars in her driveway, of the neighbors peering through their curtains. It's a misunderstanding, she would say. He would never hurt me. I fell. They would show her the video. She would break down. Yes. But her tears would be for the shame of it all, for the exposure. She would refuse to press charges. She would insist it was a one-time thing, that he was under a lot of stress. She would look at the police officers with the same pleading eyes she once used on me, begging them to leave, to not make a big deal out of it. And she would look at me, or think of me, not with gratitude, but with the deepest betrayal imaginable. I would be the one who had ruined everything, who had aired the family's dirty laundry, who had tried to take her husband away. And even with the video, an arrest might not stick without her testimony. And even if it did, what then? Bruce would be out on bail within hours, his fury now aimed squarely at me, and indirectly at her. What would her life become? And then there was the real anchor that chained her to him, heavier and stronger than any emotional bond, money. Bruce controlled every penny he had for years. My mother hadn't worked since she married him. The house, the cars, the savings accounts, I knew, without having to look, that he had systematically entangled her in a web of financial dependency. She had no resources, no safety net. The money I sent her every month went into a joint account he could access. She saw leaving him not as an escape, but as a leap into a terrifying abyss of poverty and uncertainty. To her, he wasn't just her husband. He was her provider, her entire world. The hand that struck her was the same one that signed the checks. Calling the police would be like trying to rescue a drowning person by throwing a rock at her head. It would be an act of violence in itself, an explosion that would leave her more broken, more alone, and more financially destitute than before. She wouldn't stand with me. She couldn't. The rage in my chest cooled, condensing into something harder, sharper. It became a plan, a cold, intricate legal strategy. This wasn't a domestic dispute to be solved with a single 911 call. This was a long-term strategic campaign to free her. I couldn't just remove the man. I had to dismantle the entire cage, the financial cage, the emotional cage, the cage of silence she had helped him build around them both. I would not be her rescuer. I would be her goddamn architect. I would build her a new reality, brick by brick. A reality where she had a choice. And to do that, I needed more than just Exhibit A. I needed a complete case file. I needed to understand their finances. I needed to find leverage. I needed to control the narrative. I stood up and walked to my desk, the external drive still in my hand. I opened my laptop, my fingers moving with a new, chilling purpose. This was my world now. Not the world of emotion and memory, but the world of evidence, of assets, of jurisdiction and liability. I was no longer Maul Erie the daughter or Maul Erie the victim. I was Maul Erie the paralegal, and I was about to prepare the most important case of my life. Bruce wasn't just going to be arrested. He was going to be systematically, legally, and financially dismantled. And I was going to be the one to do it. The first light of dawn bled through my blinds, striping the walls in shades of grey. I hadn't slept. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. The night had been a crucible, burning away the daughter and forging something else in the embers. I sat at my desk, the external hard drive connected to my laptop, its small indicator light a single, unwavering eye in the dim room. The grief was still there, a cold stone in my gut. But it was now encased in something else, the crystalline, methodical calm of my professional self. This was no longer a family crisis. It was a case. And every case begins with discovery. My first move was into the digital world, where so much of modern life is recorded and, if you know where to look, exposed. Years ago, I had set up my mother's laptop and her email account. I still had the passwords saved in a secure file under the guise of being her personal IT support for when she inevitably forgot them. It was an access I rarely used, a key to a house I never visited. Now I turned that key. I started with public records, the kind of search I could do in my sleep. The county assessor's office database was my first stop. I typed in my mother's address, the address of the house I grew up in. The property information loaded, owner, my mother's name, and his, Bruce's name, joint tenants with right of survivorship. My breath hitched. It hadn't always been that way. I dug deeper into the recorded documents, and there it was. A quitclaim deed filed 4 years ago. A single page, dense with cold legal language, bearing my mother's signature, faint and spidery, next to his bold, arrogant scroll. I downloaded the document, my paralegal training taking over. The language was standard, but its implications were devastating. With that one signature, she had gifted him half of her largest asset. More than that, the right of survivorship clause meant that if she were to die, the house in its entirety would automatically pass to him, bypassing any will or inheritance. It was a financial handcuff, locking her to him in life and erasing her legacy after death. He hadn't just moved into her house, he had legally consumed it. Next, I logged into the online portal for their joint bank account, the one my monthly support payments flowed into. For years, I had avoided looking at the statements, content to just send the money and not know where it went. That willful ignorance now felt like a criminal dereliction of duty. I opened the transaction history, setting the date range for the past 2 years. A story immediately began to unfold, written in debits and credits. My monthly deposits were there, consistent and reliable. And then came the withdrawals. His were frequent and varied, weekly cash withdrawals from an ATM near a local sports bar, charges from a high-end golf course 30 miles away, payments to an online poker site. Her spending was a stark contrast, the electric bill, the water bill, charges from the local grocery store. He was living a life of leisure on her assets and my contributions, while she was apparently subsisting on the barest of necessities. It was a slow, methodical financial bleed, the kind of abuse that leaves no visible bruises, but is just as crippling. I began downloading every statement, saving them to a new encrypted folder on the hard drive. Folder name, Financials. As I worked, a memory surfaced, a pocket of warmth in the icy landscape of my investigation. My mother's 60th birthday. She had always dreamed of a small cabin in the mountains, a quiet place to read and watch the seasons change. By then, I was doing well at the firm, and for the first time in my life, I had enough money to make a dream come true. I found a small, rustic A-frame cabin for sale in a town called Glenstone, nestled in a valley surrounded by aspens. I bought it for her. It was the proudest moment of my life, handing her the keys, seeing the pure, unadulterated joy in her eyes. A thought struck me, a sudden, urgent impulse. The cabin. At the time, putting the deed in my name had been a simple, practical matter. Her credit was poor, and it was far easier for me to secure the mortgage and manage the property taxes. We had always talked about transferring it to her name someday, but someday had never come. A simple logistical decision made out of convenience had, I realized with a jolt, become a critical strategic asset. It was the one piece of her life, of her sanctuary, that his name wasn't on, the one thing he couldn't legally touch. It was my fortress. My investigation turned to her email account. I logged in, my stomach churning with the feeling of trespassing, a feeling I quickly suppressed. This was a necessary violation. I wasn't looking for personal correspondence. I was looking for anything related to the cabin, any more financial documents. The inbox was mostly spam and newsletters. But then I clicked on the trash folder. People forget the trash folder. It's a digital purgatory where secrets often linger. And there it was, an email chain only a week old. The subject line was Glenstone Cabin Inquiry. The sender was a local realtor. The recipient was my mother's email address, but the words were clearly not hers. I opened the first message. "Hi, Catherine," the realtor wrote. "Following up on our phone call. I've pulled some comps for the property. Given the current market, I think we can list it aggressively for a quick cash sale. Let me know when would be a good time for me to come by and take a look." My blood ran cold. I scrolled down, my heart pounding. There was a reply sent 2 days later. "Tom," it read, "thanks for getting back to us. We are highly motivated sellers. Cash offer is exactly what we are looking for. The less hassle, the better. The wife is a bit sentimental about the place, so discretion is appreciated. Let's move on this quickly. Bruce?" He had signed his own name. The arrogance was staggering. He was using her email account to orchestrate the sale of a property he had no legal claim to. A property that was a gift from me to her. He wasn't just controlling her. He was liquidating her life, piece by piece, right under her nose. This wasn't just about abuse anymore. This was about theft. The discovery added a ticking clock to my plan. I had to move faster. My first call was not to the police. It was to a woman named Amelia Davies. We had started as associates at the same law firm a decade ago. She was whip-smart, relentless, and had left corporate law to start her own boutique firm specializing in asset protection and complex family law. We hadn't spoken in years, but I knew she was the one I needed. "Amelia," I said when she answered, my voice even and professional, devoid of the turmoil raging inside me. "It's Mallory Thorne. I have a sensitive, complex situation I need to discuss. It involves asset protection, fraudulent conveyance, and a vulnerable party. Are you taking new clients?" I spent 30 minutes laying out the facts, presenting the situation as a case study. I referred to my mother as the client's principal and Bruce as the adverse party. I detailed the joint tenancy deed, the financial records, the attempted sale of the cabin, and finally Exhibit A, the 8-minute video of the assault. I sent her the file while we were on the phone. The silence on her end, as she watched it, was profound. "My God, Mallory," she said, her professional tone finally cracking. "Okay, first things first. We firewall the cabin. Now, I'll draft the paperwork to move it into an irrevocable trust with you as the trustee. It will be legally untouchable by anyone for any reason. Get me a copy of the deed." The rest of the day was a blur of methodical action. I executed the documents Amelia sent over, creating a legal fortress around the Glenstone cabin. Then, I turned my attention back to the evidence. I went through the camera's cloud storage, scrolling back through the full 30 days of archived footage. I wasn't just looking for another assault. I was looking for the texture of their daily life. I found it in dozens of small, chilling clips, Bruce cornering her in the hallway, his voice a low growl. Bruce throwing a plate of food into the sink because it was cold. Bruce pacing the living room like a caged tiger, while she sat on the sofa, still as a statue. Each clip was a brick in the wall of evidence I was building. I downloaded them all, naming each file with the date, time, and a brief factual description: verbal intimidation, property damage, coercive behavior. I created spreadsheets tracing my financial support, and his corresponding withdrawals. I started a separate document, a timeline. It began 16 years ago, with a slap in a hallway, and ended last night, with a broom handle in a kitchen. I wrote down every incident I could remember, every cutting remark, every act of control. The invisible history of my family was finally being put into evidence. By the time the sun set, the hard drive was no longer just a storage device. It was an indictment. It contained a comprehensive, meticulously organized case file that laid bare the truth of the last 2 decades. I was no longer a frightened daughter acting on impulse. I was an officer of the court in my own way, preparing for a war, and I would not lose. For 3 weeks, for 21 days, I moved through my life like a submarine in the deep ocean, silent and running on a cold internal power. On the surface, I was the same Mauleary Thorn. I went to work. I drafted contracts. I ran my miles along the creek. I exchanged pleasantries with my colleagues. But beneath the surface, a different engine was humming. Every action was calculated. Every decision a move in a chess game only I knew I was playing. The hard drive sat in a locked, fireproof box in my closet. A sleeping dragon waiting for its moment to wake. The phone call was the opening move. I made it on a Tuesday afternoon from a quiet conference room at my office. I let the phone ring 4 times before my mother picked up. Mauleary, honey, is everything all right? Her voice was thin, laced with its customary anxiety. Everything's fine, Mom, I said, pitching my voice to be warm, casual, the voice of a daughter, not an avenger. I was just thinking, it's been a while since I've seen you both. I know things have been distant, and that's on me. I'd like to change that. A pause. I could hear the suspicion and the desperate hope warring on the other end of the line. Oh, well, that's lovely, dear. I was thinking I could drive down this weekend. We could have dinner Friday night. Just the 3 of us. We could even do it at the cabin. A change of scenery. I held my breath. The cabin was the key. I heard her cup the receiver, and her muffled voice talking to Bruce. A moment later, his voice came on the line, falsely jovial. Mauleary. Good to hear from you. Your mother tells me you want to come down for dinner. That's a great idea. The cabin sounds perfect. We'll see you Friday. He made the decision for her, as he always did. The bait was taken. The 48 hours before that Friday were masterclass in controlled logistics. On Wednesday evening, I left work early and drove the 2 hours to Glenstone. The cabin was cold and smelled of pine needles and dust. I didn't turn on the main lights. I worked by the glow of a headlamp, a silent operative in my own home. The security system I'd installed for my mother's safety was amateur hour compared to what I had planned now. I had spent over $1,000 on a new set of surveillance devices, the kind used by private investigators. They were infinitesimal, Wi-Fi enabled, and had crystal-clear audio capabilities. My first target was the living room. I replaced a duplex electrical outlet near the stone fireplace with one that had a camera lens no bigger than a pinprick embedded in the lower socket. I installed a smoke detector on the ceiling that wasn't a smoke detector at all. In the kitchen, a new digital clock on the counter had a wide-angle lens. In the small hallway, a coat hook. Each device was connected to a dedicated mobile hotspot I'd hidden in the attic, transmitting the encrypted feed to a new, secure cloud server, completely separate from the old system. I tested each camera's feed on a burner tablet, checking angles, ensuring there were no blind spots. The audio pickup was exceptional. I could hear the scuttling of a mouse in the walls. I worked for 4 hours. My movements precise and unhurried. There was no fear, no anxiety, just a cold, clear purpose. I was not a daughter preparing for a family dinner. I was a litigator preparing her courtroom on Friday. I arrived at 5 o'clock, a bag of groceries in my arms and a practiced, placid smile on my face. I played my role perfectly. I was the prodigal daughter, returned to make amends. I hugged my mother, a brief, stiff embrace. I nodded to Bruce, offering a polite, "It's good to see you." He was in his element, the lord of a manor that wasn't his. He poured himself a whiskey as I unpacked the groceries, making my famous lasagna. "I know it's your favorite," I announced to my mother. The evening unfolded like a carefully scripted play. We made small talk, the weather, my job, a neighbor's new dog. Bruce was smug, expansive. My sudden desire for a truce clearly fed his ego. He saw it as a capitulation, a sign that I had finally accepted his authority. He drank, pouring a second, then a third whiskey, his voice getting louder, his words slurring slightly. My mother, sensing the shift, grew quieter, her movements more cautious. I sat on the sofa, nursing a single glass of wine, watching. My phone was on the coffee table in front of me, screen down. I had already activated the voice recorder app, a redundant system. One can never have too many redundant systems. As he finished his fourth drink, I made my next move. I steered the conversation. "It must be hard for you, Bruce," I said, my tone sympathetic, looking after Mom. "She can be a handful sometimes." "I know," he grunted, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "You have no idea. Your mother, she needs a firm hand. Always has." "I know," I said, leaning forward. "She doesn't always listen. I remember. You just want what's best for her, to make her stronger. Sometimes you have to be tough to do that, right?" I was feeding him the script, giving him the justification he'd always told himself. He took the bait, his ego swelling with the whiskey. "Exactly. These women, they get emotional. They don't think straight. You have to lay down the law. She doesn't like it, but she respects it. She knows who's in charge." He looked over at my mother, who was pretending to be engrossed in a magazine, and a cruel smirk touched his lips. "Isn't that right, Catherine? You know who's in charge." She flinched and gave a small, jerky nod without looking up. "See," Bruce said, turning back to me, triumphant. "It's not always pretty. Sometimes I have to raise my voice. Sometimes she gets clumsy, but she learns. She never talks back." "Not anymore," he chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "She wouldn't dare say a word against me to anyone. Not a single word." It was a confession delivered with the casual arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. Every word was being captured in pristine, high-fidelity audio from 3 different angles. The climax came, as I knew it would, from a small, insignificant accident. My mother stood up to clear the coffee table. Her hand, trembling slightly, brushed against Bruce's whiskey glass. It tipped, spilling the dark liquid across a stack of old magazines. The change in him was instantaneous. The jovial mask fell away, revealing the predator beneath. "Goddamn it, woman," he roared, leaping to his feet. "Are you a complete idiot? Look what you did." "I'm sorry, Bruce. I'm so sorry. It was an accident," she stammered, fumbling for a napkin. He swatted her hand away. "Useless," he snarled, and then he shoved her. It wasn't a gentle push. It was a violent, two-handed shove to her chest that sent her staggering backward. She tripped over the leg of a chair and went down, landing hard on the wooden floor with a cry of pain. And I did nothing. This was the hardest part of the plan. Every instinct screamed at me to jump up, to scream, to put myself between them. The 16-year-old girl inside me was clawing at the walls of my composure. But the 34-year-old strategist held her in a grip of iron. I did not move a muscle. I just sat there, my face a carefully constructed mask of shock and concern. My eyes watched the scene unfold. My silence was my weapon. My inaction was my testimony. He stood over her, his face purple with rage, his finger jabbing in the air. Get up. Clean up your mess. She scrambled to her feet, tears streaming down her face, and scurried to the kitchen for a cloth. He turned to me, his chest still heaving. He expected me to be afraid, to cower. I just looked at him, my expression unreadable. "She's so clumsy," was all I said, my voice quiet. The assault was over. The evidence was secured. It had all been captured, the verbal admission of past abuse, the physical assault, the clear audio, and most importantly, it had all happened here in Glenstone, in a house that, thanks to Amelia, was now the sole asset of an irrevocable trust. A trust of which I was the sole trustee. He hadn't just assaulted my mother. He had done it on my property, my jurisdiction, my courtroom. The play was over. I had my confession. I had my unassailable proof. The trap was sprung. I drove back to Denver in the dead of night. The 3-hour journey a silent, suspended passage of time. I did not play the radio. I did not think. I simply was an instrument of a will that now felt separate from my own body. The daughter in me, who had sat frozen on that couch, her heart a block of ice, had been left behind in the cabin. The person driving was someone else entirely, someone forged in the cold fire of necessity, a functionary, an executive. I arrived at my apartment just before 2 a.m. and went straight to my desk. There was no sleep to be had, only work. I offloaded the new video files and the audio recording from my phone. I labeled them with a clear, dispassionate system, Glenstone Cam 1 Video, Glenstone. Audio confession. I added them to the master dossier on the external hard drive. The case file was now complete. It was irrefutable. At 6:01 a.m. on Saturday morning, a single encrypted email left my outbox. The recipient was Amelia Davies. The subject line read, "Redhorn Matter, Supplemental Evidence and Authorization to Proceed." The body of the email was brief. "Amelia, attached you will find new evidence obtained last night, including high-definition video and audio. The incident occurred on a property held by the trust we established. I believe this provides clear predicate for both criminal charges and immediate civil action. You are authorized to proceed with the full scope of the strategy we discussed. File the TRO and the injunction first thing Monday morning. I will be handling the criminal complaint in person today. Mall Erie." I didn't need to wait for her reply. The machine was now in motion. My next stop was not my local police department. It was the Glenstone County Sheriff's Office. A small sandstone building an hour's drive back toward the mountains. Jurisdiction was everything. The assault had happened here. This was their case. I walked in at 9 a.m. I was dressed not as a victim, but as I would for a client meeting, dark slacks, a silk blouse, a tailored blazer. I carried a leather briefcase. When the deputy at the desk asked how he could help me, my voice was calm and steady. "I need to file a report regarding a felony assault that occurred last night. I have video and audio evidence, as well as supporting financial documentation. I need to speak with a detective." The confidence and the legal terminology had their intended effect. I wasn't treated as a hysterical civilian. I was treated as a professional. I was led to a small, quiet interview room, and a few minutes later, a detective in his late 40s with tired eyes and a thick mustache introduced himself as Detective Miller. I did not weep. I did not raise my voice. I laid out the facts with the same clinical precision I had used with Amelia. I spoke of a long history of coercive control and financial abuse culminating in 2 specific documented acts of physical violence. I then opened my briefcase and placed the external hard drive on the table between us. On this drive, I said, you will find a complete dossier. It is organized into folders. The first, labeled Primary Evidence, contains 2 video files. The first is a video of an assault on my mother, Catherine Thorne, that occurred 3 weeks ago. The second is a video of another assault that occurred last night at my property in Glenstone. This second file includes clear audio of the perpetrator, Bruce Oster, confessing to a history of physical abuse. The folder labeled Financials contains 2 years of bank statements detailing a pattern of financial exploitation. The folder labeled Supporting Evidence contains dozens of shorter video clips showing a consistent pattern of intimidation and verbal abuse. Finally, there is a document named Timeline, which provides a narrative context for all the evidence. Miller stared at the hard drive, then back at me. His tired eyes had sharpened. He had likely never had a case handed to him on such a pristine evidentiary platter. And you're willing to testify to all of this? He asked. I am, I said, and the evidence will testify for itself. I left the station an hour later, with a case number written on a small slip of paper. The wheels of criminal justice, so often slow and grinding, were about to be accelerated by the high-octane fuel of digital proof. I was halfway back to Denver when the call came. It was from the Glenstone realtor, Tom. His voice was flustered, panicked. Miss Thorne. This is Tom Passon. I just received a very aggressive letter from an attorney named Amelia Davies. It's a cease and desist. It says I have no legal authority to list the Glenstone cabin. That my contact, Mr. Oster, committed fraud by representing himself as a party with interest in the property. It's threatening sanctions for professional misconduct. That is all correct, Tom, I said, my voice cool as ice. You were being used as an instrument in an attempt to fraudulently liquidate an asset from a trust. I suggest you comply with every word of Ms. Davies's letter. I hung up before he could reply. The first pillar of Bruce's financial world had just been reduced to dust. The arrest happened at 4:52 p.m. that afternoon. I wasn't there to see it, but I watched it. I was logged into the old camera system at my mother's house. A silent observer from 100 miles away. I saw the 2 Glenstone County Sheriff's cars pull up to the curb, their lights off. I saw 2 deputies walk to the front door. The doorbell camera caught the look of pure, baffled arrogance on Bruce's face as he answered. The conversation was inaudible, but his gestures grew more agitated, his face darkening. Then they turned him around and put his hands behind his back. The click of the handcuffs was a faint metallic sound that the microphone barely picked up. It was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. My mother appeared in the doorway, then, a frantic, ghostly figure. Her hands flew to her mouth as they led him to one of the cars. It was only then that they turned on the lights, and the quiet suburban street was suddenly bathed in strobing flashes of red and blue. Her call came 10 minutes later. It wasn't the call of a woman who had been liberated. It was the shriek of a hostage who had just seen her captor shot. Molieri, what did you do? The police. They took Bruce. They said you filed a report. How could you do this to us? You've ruined us. You've ruined everything. Her voice was a raw, hysterical torrent of accusation and terror. I let her scream. When she finally paused to take a ragged breath, I spoke. My voice was low, and I did not let it waver. I did what you were never able to do, I said. I told the truth. You don't understand. He'll lose his job. What will we do? How will we live? That is no longer your problem to solve. Mom, the police will want to talk to you. I suggest you cooperate. No, I'll tell them it was a lie, a misunderstanding. You can't, I said. And for the first time, a sliver of the cold fury I felt seeped into my voice. Because they have the videos. They have all of it. They have the one from the kitchen 3 weeks ago, and they have the one from the cabin last night, the one where he shoves you to the floor, the one where he admits he's been hitting you for years. They have it all. Mom, there are no more lies to hide behind. I hung up the phone. The line was drawn. Monday morning, as Bruce was in a county courtroom for his arraignment, Amelia filed the civil suit. A process server delivered the papers to him at the courthouse. It was a multi-pronged legal assault. A petition to force the partition and sale of the primary residence, with proceeds to be held in escrow pending a forensic accounting of his financial abuse. A request for a permanent restraining order barring him from coming within 500 feet of my mother, or the Glenstone cabin. A motion to freeze all known joint financial assets pending a full discovery of his fraudulent spending. The awakening was not a gentle one. It was a sudden, violent plunge into a world where actions had consequences. My mother, at first, refused to speak to the detective who came to her house. She was loyal to her captor, but she couldn't escape the truth. He showed her the video from the cabin on his department-issued tablet. He made her watch herself being shoved to the floor. He made her listen to her own husband's voice, bragging about how she would never dare to speak out. Her defiance, the detective later told Amelia, crumbled into a quiet, shuddering heap. She couldn't deny the evidence of her own eyes and ears. Her cooperation was reluctant, whispered through tears, but it was enough. The official report now contained a statement from the victim corroborating the evidence. The case was sealed. The war had begun. The legal system is a glacier. It moves with immense, crushing force, but it moves at its own pace, governed by filings and dockets and continuances. I had set it in motion, and I trusted its power. But a glacier doesn't stop the immediate threat. It doesn't change the minds of a community. Bruce was out on bail, living in their house, while the wheels of justice slowly began to turn. The law would give my mother justice eventually, but it wouldn't give her clarity. It wouldn't break the spell. For that, I needed a different kind of court, the court of public opinion. There are branches of my family that exist in a state of willful blindness, bound by a code of silence and the pathological fear of what the neighbors will think. Then there is my cousin Sarah. We were close as children, allies in the stifling atmosphere of family gatherings. She had a keen eye for hypocrisy and a low tolerance for. She had moved away years ago, but was still connected to the old neighborhood through the digital web of social media. She had always looked at Bruce with a cool, appraising suspicion. She was the one. A week after the arrest, on a Sunday night, I opened a new email. I attached one file, Glenstone 220 Cam 1 video, the one with the clear audio, the one with the shove and the confession. The body of the email contained only one sentence: Sarah, I thought you should see this. I trust your judgment. I didn't tell her what to do with it. I didn't have to. Trusting her judgment was the entire point. It was a strategic release of information. A single drop of dye into a clear pool of water. I hit send and then I closed my laptop. I had just lit a fuse, and I had no intention of watching it burn. For 2 days, there was silence. Bruce's preliminary hearing was set. Amelia was drowning his newly hired small-town lawyer in a deluge of motions and discovery requests. It was all procedural, all happening behind the thick, soundproof walls of the legal system. And then on Tuesday evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. It wasn't a question or a statement. It was just a link. I clicked it. It took me to a public Facebook group, Oak Creek Community Watch. It had over 5,000 members. The top post, uploaded 40 minutes earlier by a name I didn't recognize, was a video, my video. The thumbnail was a blurry image of the cabin's living room. The caption was simple and devastating. This is Bruce Oster from our church board. This happened last Friday in Glenstone. This is what he does when he thinks no one is watching. I didn't watch the video again. I scrolled down to the comments. They were a torrent. A digital flash flood of shock and outrage. Is this real? I can't believe it. That's Bruce from St. Jude's. I always thought he was a creep. The way he looked at people. That poor woman. Listen to what he's saying. He's admitting to it. Someone needs to call the police. They already have. A new comment appeared. He was arrested on Saturday. My brother-in-law is a deputy. The fire was spreading faster than I could have imagined. I watched dispassionately as the number of shares climbed. 10, 50, 200. It was being shared to other community pages, to personal timelines. The private shame of my mother's kitchen and my cabin was now a public spectacle, a raw, undeniable document of a man's cruelty. The mask he had worn for decades, the carefully crafted image of the respectable church board member, the friendly neighbor, the firm but fair family man, was being publicly, violently torn from his face. The fallout was swift and brutal. By the next morning, the pastor from St. Jude's had released a statement announcing that Bruce Oster had been asked to step down from the church council, effective immediately. The owner of the construction supply company, where he worked as a sales manager, sent out a company-wide memo placing him on indefinite administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Friends who had posted messages of support on his personal Facebook page after his arrest quietly deleted them. His digital world was being scrubbed clean of his existence. The neighbors my mother had been so terrified of offending now crossed the street to avoid walking past her house. The glacier of the law was still miles away, but the avalanche of social consequence had already buried him. And then, as I knew they would, the family phone calls began. My Aunt Carol, my mother's older sister, was the first. Her voice was a high, reedy instrument of panicked indignation. "Mauleary, what have you done?" she shrieked without so much as a hello. "Your mother is a wreck. The whole family is being humiliated. That video, it's everywhere. How could you air our private business out for the whole world to see? Have you no sense of decency?" I held the phone a few inches from my ear, letting the wave of her hysteria wash over me. I said nothing. "This is a family matter," she continued, her voice rising. "These things should be handled in private. You've brought such shame on your mother. People are talking. Bruce has lost everything. You think this helps her? You've just made everything a million times worse." The old Mauleary would have defended herself. She would have explained, argued, listed the legal and moral justifications for her actions. She would have become entangled in the toxic, circular logic of family shame. But I was not the old Mauleary. "Is that all, Carol?" I asked, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. The question stopped her mid-rant. What do you mean?" "I'm trying to talk to you." "I'm not having this conversation," I said calmly. "You're not concerned about what he did. You're concerned about what people think. We have nothing to discuss." And I hung up. The calls kept coming. An uncle who accused me of being vindictive and cruel. A cousin who told me I was destroying my mother's life, and that she'd never forgive me. With each one, my response was the same, a calm, impenetrable silence, followed by a quiet disconnection. I was a brick wall. I was a closed door. I was no longer a participant in the family drama. I was an observer of its decay. They weren't angry that my mother was being abused. They were angry that the secret was out. Their comfort was more important than her safety. Through it all, I did not call my mother, and she did not call me. The restraining order forced Bruce to move out. He was staying with his brother on the other side of the state. She was alone in that house for the first time in 2 decades, surrounded by the ruins of her life. I knew she was being inundated with calls from relatives, drowning in their toxic sympathy for him and their condemnation of me. She was trapped between the man who abused her and the daughter who had exposed it. I had to give her a way out. Not a demand, not an ultimatum, but a choice. On Friday, exactly 1 week after that horrible dinner, I opened my email. I composed a new message, the last I intended to send for a long time. The recipient was my mother. The subject line was empty. The body of the email was as spare and as powerful as I could make it. I wrote and rewrote it a dozen times, chipping away at every extraneous word until only the essential truth remained. Mom, the choice was never between me and him. It has always been between the life you have and the life you deserve. When you're ready to choose yourself over him, I'll be here. Mall Erie. I hit send. It was an abdication and an invitation all at once. I was releasing her from any obligation to me, from the pressure of having to pick a side in a war she hadn't asked for. But I was also leaving a single door unlocked, a single light on in the distance. The next move had to be hers. I could not force her to walk it. The days that followed were defined by a profound and heavy silence. 3 weeks translated into 504 hours of a void where a relationship used to be. My phone, once a source of intermittent anxiety, became a dead object on my nightstand. No texts appeared and vanished. No calls came, hysterical or otherwise. I had detonated a bomb in the center of my mother's life. And now, in the ringing aftermath, there was nothing. The digital tether between us had been severed, and I did not know if it could ever be reattached. I returned to my life, or what was left of it. I walked the polished corridors of Uniplex Health, my heels clicking with a confidence I no longer felt. I submerged myself in the cool, clean logic of contract law. I redlined clauses, debated indemnification, and drafted liability waivers. The work was a refuge of sorts, a place where problems had solutions that could be found in statutes and precedents. It was a world of black and white, a stark contrast to the messy, bleeding grey of my own reality. But the comfort it once provided was gone. The fortress of my career now felt like a paper castle. My colleagues noticed a change. I was quieter, more remote. The carefully constructed wall of professional privacy I had always maintained now seemed higher, colder. They would ask, "Everything okay, Mall Erie?" and I would nod, offering a thin, meaningless smile. "Just busy," I would say. They accepted the answer. People rarely push past the first line of defense. My apartment, my sanctuary of muted tones and perfect order, felt different, too. The solitude I had so deliberately cultivated now felt like what it truly was, loneliness. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was accusatory. I would sit on my grey sofa, the same one where I had received that phantom text message, and the quiet would press in on me, thick and suffocating. I had won. I had executed my plan with flawless, chilling precision. Bruce was legally and socially neutered, a pariah awaiting the slow, grinding judgment of the courts. I had taken back control, so why did I feel so utterly, terrifyingly alone? In the dead of night, the guilt would come for me. It's important to make the distinction. I felt no regret. Regret is for mistakes, for actions one wishes they could take back. I would not take back a single thing I did. What I felt was a far more complex and corrosive emotion, the torment of the surgeon who performs a life-saving amputation. I would lie in bed and imagine my mother's days. I saw her alone in that house, the silence there even deeper and more menacing than in my apartment. I saw her walking through the grocery store, feeling the stares of her neighbors, hearing their whispered conversations. I pictured her answering the phone to our relatives, to my Aunt Carol, and absorbing their poison, their accusations that she had allowed me to bring shame upon them all. I had freed her from a cage, yes, but I had released her into a wasteland of public humiliation and private desolation, with no map and no companion. My final email to her, the one that offered a choice, had been met with the same crushing silence as everything else. Had I miscalculated? Had I overestimated her strength, or underestimated the depth of her bondage? The thought that she might choose the memory of him over the reality of me was a constant, dull ache in my chest. But I did not break. I did not reach for the phone to call her, to beg for a response. My resolve, forged in that cold moment of decision 3 weeks prior, had to be stronger than my guilt. There was one ritual that kept me anchored. Every evening when I came home from work, I would open my laptop. I would bypass the bookmarks for legal databases and news sites and click on a single private link. It opened the feed to the new covert security system in the Glenstone cabin. I would watch the empty rooms. I would see the late afternoon sun slant across the wooden floor where my mother had fallen. I would watch the shadows lengthen and the stone fireplace grow dark. I saw dust motes dancing in the still air. I saw nothing, and that nothing was my salvation. This was not the panicked, voyeuristic surveillance of my mother's house. This was different. That had been an act of dread, a vigil kept over a prison. This was an act of ownership, of peace. Every time I looked at that silent, empty cabin, I was reminded of what I had done. I had secured a perimeter. I had established a sanctuary. That small A-frame, held and inviolate in the trust Amelia had created, was a tangible piece of my power. It was proof that I was no longer the helpless girl in the hallway. I could identify a threat, form a strategy, and execute it. That camera feed was a silent testament. I am not powerless anymore. This newfound strength, however, did not heal the old wounds. It only cauterized them. One evening, staring at the empty cabin on my screen, I had a moment of startling clarity. I had spent my entire adult life building a fortress, only to realize I had locked myself inside. My solitude, my control, my emotional distance, these weren't signs of strength. They were symptoms. They were the scars left by a childhood spent learning that feelings were dangerous and silence was survival. I had surgically removed Bruce from our lives, but his ghost still lived inside me, dictating the terms of my existence. The next morning, I did something the 16-year-old Maulery would have considered an admission of absolute defeat. I went online and searched for a therapist. I found one with a downtown office who specialized in complex trauma and family dynamics. Making the appointment was harder than calling Amelia. Harder even than walking into that sheriff's station. It was an acknowledgement that the case I truly needed to win was against the history that lived in my own head. I sat in her office the following week, a room filled with soft colors and comfortable chairs that felt entirely alien. I started to tell my story, and to my surprise, I found myself speaking in the detached, factual tone of a paralegal presenting a case. I laid out the timeline, the evidence, the pattern of coercive control. The therapist, a kind-faced woman named Dr. Alani, listened patiently. When I finished, she didn't comment on the legal strategy or the videos. She asked a simple question. "That's the story of what happened to your mother," she said gently. "Can you tell me the story of what happened to you?" And for the first time, in that quiet, safe room, I began to excavate the ruins of my own past. I spoke of the slap, of the constant casual cruelty, of my mother's silent complicity, of learning to make myself small and invisible. It was the hardest testimony I had ever given. I left that first session feeling raw and exposed, but also lighter. The silence from my mother continued, a gaping hole in my life. But for the first time, I realized I could not wait for her to fill it. I had my own work to do, my own house to put in order. I was still alone, but I was no longer adrift. The call came on a Tuesday night, nearly a month after I had sent the email. It came at 10:04 p.m., an hour when the only news is bad news. Rain was lashing against my apartment window, a frantic drumming rhythm that matched the sudden chaos in my chest. For weeks, my phone had been a silent, useless thing. Now it screamed into the darkness. The screen illuminating a single word that seemed both alien and intimately familiar, Mom. I stared at it for a full 3 rings. My heart a frantic drum against my ribs. 100 possibilities, all of them catastrophic, tore through my mind. Had he found her? Had he hurt her again? Was this a call from a hospital? Or worse, was it him using her phone to get to me? I finally answered, my hand shaking. Silence, then a ragged, indrawn breath, a sound scraped raw by weeping or exhaustion, or both. More eerie, the voice was my mother's, but it was a version I had never heard before. It was stripped of everything, of her anxiety, of her placating softness, of her fear. All that was left was a brittle, exhausted core. Mom, are you okay? Where are you? I left him. Each word was a struggle. I'm at the gas station, the all-night mart near Glenstone. I didn't know where else to go. Can you come get me? The world seemed to tilt and then settle into a new, strange alignment. The question I had been asking myself for a month, what would she choose, was answered. She had chosen this. Not me. Not yet. But this, a fluorescent-lit gas station in the middle of a rainstorm, is a beginning. I'm on my way, I said, my own voice surprisingly steady. Don't move. I'll be there in 2 hours. I didn't ask for details. I didn't ask why or how. The time for questions was over. This was a time for action. I threw on jeans and a sweatshirt, grabbed my keys, and was out the door in less than 3 minutes. The drive was a hypnotic blur of wet asphalt and the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers. The rain fell in relentless, silver sheets, turning the highway into a dark, rushing river. My mind, which had been a storm of guilt and anger for weeks, was now eerily calm. The choice was made. The waiting was over. All that was left was the logistics of the aftermath. I rehearsed nothing. I planned no speeches, no recriminations, no comforting words. I just drove, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my eyes fixed on the ribbon of road unfolding before me. I was a vessel, a vehicle, and my only purpose was to get to that gas station. When I pulled in, the place was an island of harsh, artificial light in the overwhelming darkness, and I saw her. She was huddled on a narrow bench under the awning, out of the direct rain, but still exposed, a small, solitary figure in the vast, wet night. She had one small duffel bag at her feet. She was staring out into the storm, her face pale in the greenish glow of the station sign. I parked the car directly in front of the bench and got out. The cold rain instantly soaked my hair. She looked up as I approached. Her face was a ruin. She wasn't crying, but her eyes were swollen and bloodshot, the landscape left behind after the tears have finally run dry. There were new, faint lines of exhaustion etched around her mouth. She looked older than she had a month ago. She looked 100 years old. We didn't speak. There were no words for this moment. I reached down, picked up her bag, it was shockingly light, and put it in the back seat. I opened the passenger door for her. She stood up, her movement stiff and slow, and slid into the seat. I closed the door, walked around to my side, and got in. The car suddenly filled with the damp, cold smell of the storm. I started the engine and pulled out of the gas station, back onto the dark, empty highway. The only sounds in the car were the steady beat of the wipers, the hum of the engine, and her quiet, ragged breathing. I turned the heat up, and a blast of warm air filled the space between us. For 20 minutes, we drove in complete silence. Two strangers sharing a small, warm space while the world wept outside. Finally, she spoke, her voice still a raw whisper, her eyes fixed on the passing darkness. "He got the papers from your lawyer," she said. "The ones about selling the house. He lost his mind. He said I had conspired with you, that I had betrayed him." She paused, and I could hear a faint tremor in her voice. "He didn't hit me. He just looked at me. And he said that if I ever wanted to see a cent from the sale of the house, I would sign a statement saying you made it all up, that you manipulated the videos, that you were an unstable, vindictive daughter." My hands tightened on the wheel, but I said nothing. I kept my eyes on the road. "He had the papers drawn up by his lawyer," she continued. "He put them on the kitchen table and told me to sign. He said we could fix this, that we could fight you together. All I had to do was sign. All I had to do was choose him." She fell silent again, and I waited. I knew this was the heart of it. This was the precipice she had been standing on for a month. "I stood there looking at those papers," she whispered. "And I thought about everything, all the years, all the times I told myself he was just stressed. All the times I told you not to make a big deal. And I knew I couldn't do it. Not anymore." She turned her head then, and looked at me for the first time. Her eyes swimming with a sorrow so deep it felt bottomless. "After he was arrested, I found the video file you sent to Sarah. It was still in the trash folder of my email. I don't know why I did it, but I watched it. The one from the cabin. I've watched it every night since he's been gone. I made myself watch it. I made myself listen." Her voice broke on the last word, a choked, guttural sound. "I used to think my silence was to protect you," she said, the words coming out in a rush, a confession that had been dammed up for decades. "When you were a teenager, I told myself that if I just kept the peace, if I didn't provoke him, he would leave you alone. I thought I was being a good mother. I thought I was absorbing the impact to keep you safe." She let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded like a sob. "Turns out," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper of devastating clarity, "it was just protecting the wrong person." The words hung in the air, a final, absolute truth. This was it. The admission, the awakening, the end of a story that had been written in silence and fear for as long as I could remember. I didn't reply. What could I say? "I told you so. It's about time." Any words I could offer would be cheap. They would diminish the profound, agonizing journey she had just made to get to this point. My silence, once a shield I used to protect myself from her, now became a space I held for her to be heard. I reached forward and turned the heater up another notch, pushing the fan to a higher setting. It was a small, simple gesture, a practical act of care in a moment that was too heavy for words. We drove the rest of the way in that same shared quiet. As we turned onto the gravel road leading to the cabin, the rain began to soften. Turning from a roar to a gentle patter, I pulled up to the dark, silent A-frame. I turned off the engine, and the silence that descended was different. It was no longer empty. It was peaceful. I got out of the car, unlocked the front door, and reached inside to flip on the porch light. A warm yellow glow spilled out onto the wet steps. I turned back to the car and opened her door. "We're here," I said softly. She looked at the lit doorway, then back at me, and for the first time that night, a single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She got out of the car and, without looking back, walked slowly up the steps and into the light. I followed her inside, closing the door on the storm. The month that followed our return to the cabin was a season of quiet healing. We lived in a gentle, fragile truce with the world and with each other. There were no grand emotional conversations, no dramatic rehashing of the past. There was no need. The truth, once spoken, had cleared the air, leaving behind a space where something new could begin to grow. We fell into a simple rhythm. I would work remotely from a small desk overlooking the aspen grove, while my mother would read for hours in an old armchair, a cup of tea growing cold beside her. Sometimes I would find her just staring out the window, her expression unreadable, and I would let her be. She was processing 2 decades of a life she had survived, but never truly lived. It was a journey she had to make alone. Amelia's emails arrived like clockwork, neat, concise summaries of our legal progress. The first came 2 weeks in. The court had granted a permanent restraining order. Bruce was legally barred from coming within 1,000 feet of my mother, or any property she inhabited. He was a ghost, finally and formally exorcised from her life. The second email came a week later. The paperwork for the Glenstone cabin had been finalized. It was now and forever the property of the trust. My fortress was secure. The house in the suburbs was being sold. The proceeds held in a court-controlled account, awaiting a judge's order to untangle their finances and repay what he had taken. Each email was another lock clicking into place, another bus sliding across a door that would never be opened again. During that time, I did one last thing for myself. I opened the dossier on my hard drive, selected the video file from the cabin, and composed an email to the State Coalition Against Elder Abuse. I explained the context briefly and attached the file. I didn't do it for revenge. Revenge was a fire that had burned itself out, leaving behind the cold, clean ash of justice. I did it because the video was more than just my story. It was a testament to a silent epidemic. The reply came the next day, a short but heartfelt message from a director at the agency. It thanked me for my courage and asked for my permission to use the anonymized audio in their training materials for law enforcement and social workers. I granted it without hesitation. My pain would become someone else's education. My story would become a tool to help someone else write a different ending. The final confrontation took place not in a home, but in a courtroom. It wasn't a dramatic criminal trial. Bruce had accepted a plea bargain to avoid one, but it was a final hearing in the civil case. The room was sterile and impersonal, all polished wood and muted lighting. My mother sat beside me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was visibly nervous, but she was there. That was a victory in itself. Bruce sat at the opposite table with his lawyer, a shrunken, diminished version of the man who had terrorized my childhood. He looked grey and tired. He did not look at us. Amelia was questioning him about his financial control, establishing the pattern of abuse for the judge. His answers were monosyllabic, sullen. Finally, she turned to the judge. Your Honor, we would like to play a short video clip previously submitted as evidence that speaks to the defendant's character and his history of unacknowledged behavior. The court officer dimmed the lights. A large screen descended from the ceiling. And then the living room of my cabin appeared, stark and clear. The audio was perfect. The entire courtroom heard his whiskey-fueled confession. His arrogant boasts about how my mother knew who was in charge. How she wouldn't dare say a word. The courtroom was utterly silent. The only sound, his slurred, cruel voice echoing in the still air. Then came the spill, the roar of his anger, the shove. The sound of my mother's body hitting the floor was a dull, sickening thud that seemed to shake the entire room. I did not watch the screen. I watched Bruce. He stared at the table in front of him, his head sinking lower and lower as his own voice condemned him. When the video showed him shoving my mother, his head dropped completely until his chin was resting on his chest. He was a man defeated, not by a lawyer's argument, but by the irrefutable truth of his own actions, played back for the world to see. I did not smile. I did not cry. My expression remained a calm, steady blank. I simply watched him. My silence, a final, unreachable wall. The terrified 16-year-old in the hallway had finally been avenged, not with a shout, but with the quiet, unwavering power of the truth. When the hearing concluded and the judge had issued his final orders, we stood to leave. The legal battle was over. As we walked out into the hallway, I saw Detective Miller. He nodded at me, a look of professional respect in his tired eyes. "Miss Thorne," he said. "The district attorney's office asked me to retrieve the original hard drive from you to be entered into the permanent evidence archive." I stopped and looked at him. I opened my briefcase and showed him the small black external drive nestled inside. "You have the copies I provided, Detective," I said. "They have been certified and entered into the record. They are legally sufficient for any and all future proceedings, including any appeals." "I understand that," he said patiently. "But for a case this serious, the original is usually held by the state." "No," I said, my voice quiet but absolutely firm. I closed the briefcase. "The state has its evidence. This dossier, the complete story, is mine. I am keeping it." He held my gaze for a moment, and I think he understood. This wasn't about legal procedure. It was about something more fundamental. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "As you wish," he said, and walked away. I kept the hard drive. I keep it still. It sits in a fireproof box in my closet. Not as a trophy, not as a reminder of the pain, but as a testament. It is the official record, the unchangeable story. It is a quiet, powerful promise to myself that no one will ever be able to rewrite my history, or deny my truth again. The past can be forgotten, memories can fade, and stories can be twisted. But the data does not lie. The truth is not subject to appeal. We live in the cabin now, my mother and I. She is slowly finding her way back to herself. Last week, she started planting a small garden in the front yard, her hands digging into the rich soil, coaxing new life from the earth. We still don't talk much about what happened. We don't have to. We are building a new story now, one wordless day at a time, in the quiet, peaceful sanctuary I fought to secure for us both.